What is crime, deviance, and the process of criminalization? How do laws and regulations maintain social order? How do they create barriers to social order? How does crime, deviance, and punishment lead to social problems? And how do these intersect with other forms of social inequality? What institutions do we use to control crime and deviance in society? And what are the consequences for those institutions and for various groups of people? What problems emerge from the ways in which we choose to punish rule violators? On this episode of Social Problems, we're talking about crime, deviance, and the criminal justice system. So sit back, grab a snack, and let's get to it. My name is Dr. Derek Silva, and I'm an associate professor of criminology studying harm and injustice in the social world. On today's episode of Social Problems, we're talking about crime, criminalization, punishment, and the criminal justice system. This week, we are introduced to the topics of crime, deviance, and punishment, and talk about their effects on society. Crime is defined as any behavior that knowingly and intentionally violates the written laws in a given jurisdiction. In order for something to be considered a crime, it undergoes a process of codification, or the enshrinement of a set of principles into listed laws or regulations. In other words, nothing is inherently considered a crime, not even the most supposedly egregious activities. For example, you might think that homicide is one of the most inherently criminal acts. Homicide, or the killing of a human being by another, either directly or indirectly by any means, including murder, which is the unlawful killing of another human being with malicious intent, and manslaughter, which is the unlawful killing of another person without sufficient intent to constitute murder. This is certainly tragic and absolutely harmful. But is the intentional taking of one's life considered criminal in every single case? Is it inherently criminal? Well, empirically, the answer is no. What about state sponsored killing, like we have long seen with capital punishment in the United States? What about war and military intervention? There are a number of contexts where the intentional killing of another person is not criminal because it is not criminalized through the process of codification of principles into law. We tend to think of crime insofar as conventional crimes, or the traditionally illegal behaviors that most people think of as crime. However, the social construction of crime and the process of criminalization are much more complex than this. Most often, we codify various forms of deviance, defined here as actions, behaviors, or activities that depart from so called usual or conventional and accepted standards into law in order to criminalize them. Criminalization refers to the action of turning an activity or behavior into a criminal offense by making it illegal through the process of codification. Laws are then the rules of conduct that may provide for the punishment of violators. In other words, the formal rules about what a society's members can and cannot do. The differences between crime and deviance are very important. A crime is by definition always something that deviates from socially accepted conventions. However, deviance is not always a crime. For example, while by definition a crime would be against socially accepted norms, deviance can take on a range of forms that never violate any crime at all. For instance, if one joins a non-violent cult, or deviates from a number of socially accepted norms of gender and sexuality. In fact, many forms of deviance completely rule and help society break down a number of socially erected norms that reinforce forms of structural misogyny, racism, and ethnocentrism. Often, the process of criminalization is driven by moral panic and moral entrepreneurs, which you'll recall are folks that seek to influence a group to adopt or maintain a norm. In this context, moral entrepreneurs often work to establish or reinforce social norms and thus delineate limits for what might be considered deviant with the hopes that it might become codified in law. For example, Mothers Against Drunk Driving has been incredibly successful in criminalizing driving under the influence. First with alcohol as the core feature, and now with other substances like marijuana. For an activity or behavior to be considered a crime, it must be enshrined in law as a crime. In Canada, this is done through the Criminal Code of Canada. The Criminal Code is a federal level act that must be amended by passing a bill through both the House of Commons and the Senate, and it must receive royal assent. For behavior to be considered a crime, it must violate this criminal law, not civil law, not administrative or tax law, and importantly, not regulations. Each of these forms of social control may work to control some form of deviance, but they do not criminalize behaviors in and of themselves. Only the criminal code can do that in Canada. The chapter also talks about the relationship between laws and crime and how each is used to maintain social order in society via rules and regulations. Social order can perhaps best be defined as the prevalence of harmonious relationships that exist when rules are obeyed and social situations are controlled and predictable. Rules serve not only to show which behaviors are acceptable, but also to allow participants to anticipate the behavior of others. Social disorder, on the other hand, is the uncertain and unpredictable condition in which rules are routinely disobeyed and laws are broken. The environment is unsafe and the boundaries of acceptable behavior have broken down. Laws are passed in order to ensure social order and protect against social disorder. They are intended to provide consistency and predictability to social life, and they thus try to target any forms of deviance that may destabilize the social order. There are many challenges in reading criminal statistics, and the statistics that are revealed may vary depending on who is doing the reporting, as well as what is being reported and how. Canadian crime statistics, which are often based on conviction records, offer only a glimpse of the actual amount of crime in any given society. Of the many criminal incidents, only a few are reported, and even fewer result in arrests, convictions, and ultimately imprisonment. These are forms of self-reported data. To get the true picture of crime, we must look to self-reported data. Self-reporting is when the victim reports to authorities that a crime has occurred. This is the most direct method of measuring crime rates. However, it is not the most accurate, as changes in the crime rate reflect changes in victims' willingness to report. This is what is called the crime funnel in criminological circles. Of all the total crimes committed, only a few are reported and even fewer result in any conviction. Measuring the total rate of crime is difficult because of incomplete self-reporting and police records. These records miss what criminologists call the dark figure of crime, or the unreported or never followed up crime that exists in everyday life and never reported to police. Because of the crime funnel and the dark figure of crime, many criminologists believe that victimization surveys offer the most precise data. Victimization surveys are samples of people asked how many times within a given time period they've been the victim of a particular crime. The chapter discusses the various crimes of violence, including homicide and assault, and points out that they are known as conventional crimes, despite their rarity. In other words, they are considered crimes that most would consider quote-unquote traditional and almost universally thought to be criminal. Violent crimes account for only about 20% of crime, contrary to the impression presented on news channels and in popular culture. In addition to these violent crimes, the chapter also talks about non-violent crimes and organized crimes. Most crimes in Canada are non-violent forms like theft, break and enter, mischief, and vice crimes, which are deviant behaviors that may be defined as immoral, like gambling, prostitution and other sex work, drug use, and trafficking. These crimes provide the greatest opportunity for organized crime. There are also occupational crimes. For example, white-collar crimes are the crimes committed by so-called white-collared workers, typically in the course of financial business, and management in the course of their occupations. White-collar crimes are performed in the course of normal work and occur in reputable organizations. For example, a Ponzi scheme led by the CEO of a reputable insurance brokerage would be considered white-collar crime. Historically, the punishments for white-collar crime have been far less intense than other forms of violent and non-violent criminal activities, highlighting the political economy of the criminal justice system. There is also high level and abstract crime in the form of criminal networks and organizations. This is called organized crime, or when a group or system of professional criminals who practice illegal activities that are coordinated and controlled through a hierarchical system of bosses. It prospers under four conditions in a social system: when inequality is common, when poverty and prejudice keep people from moving to easily find work, when people lack good access to healthcare, welfare, education, and good quality police protections, and when people lack human capital and cultural capital. The most notable example of organized crime in Canada is the infamous Rizzuto crime family, who are leaders of La Cosa Nostra, or the Sicilian Mafia, in Canada. The chapter discusses the demography of crime as it relates to both offenders and victims. The influence of gender on both offenders and victims is discussed, as is the role of differential socialization in society, which creates a gender gap in the perpetration of crime. Most perpetrators and the victims of crime tend to be less educated young men. Women commit far fewer crimes than men, and this gender gap in crime, whether organized, professional, or amateur crime, is almost universal. Some researchers argue that biology and higher levels of testosterone causes aggression in males, and this is what's called the field of biosocial criminology. This approach has been heavily critiqued as being based on little or inaccurate empirical data. In other words, as being scientifically illegitimate and perhaps unreliable. The interaction between age and crime are further discussed in this week's material. And attention is drawn to how the cultural norm of aggressiveness may partially account for why younger men are more likely to commit crimes. Boys and young men are more likely to commit crimes than older people, particularly property and violent crimes. People aged 20 to 60 are more likely to be unemployed or to work in low-wage jobs. Many criminologists have found that forms of aggression are embedded in cultural norms for many young men, which may in part explain higher rates of crime. For your Read, Watch, Respond, please answer the following question. What is the relationship between crime, law, and social order? The demographics of victims are also discussed in the chapter, with attention focused on the characteristics that may make some individuals more at risk to experience crime. Just as criminal offenders are mainly male, so too are the victims of crime. However, men are disproportionately the perpetrators of domestic and sex-based crimes, and women are disproportionately their victims. Indigenous folks are far more likely to be victimized by violent crimes, including sexual assault, robbery, and physical assault. Most criminologists argue that these rates of increased victimization are due to the broad structural conditions that continue to systematically discriminate against those folks. For instance, if the entire criminal justice system, including police, has historically discriminated against a community, whether that be a Black community, indigenous community, or other marginalized communities, folks within that community may lack the resources to provide for their family in non-criminal ways, thereby increasing crime. Victims of those crimes may also have had past negative experiences with the criminal justice system, which make them less likely to report and thus more likely to be victimized again. And this cycle tends to repeat itself over time, causing many problems in those communities. In addition to the experience of victimization that can be experienced at the hands of an offender, the chapter discusses how individuals may experience secondary victimization through their interactions with the criminal justice system. Secondary victimization is when there is additional victimization caused by the responses of the justice system, for example, the police, or significant individuals like family members to the victim. Sadly, this is incredibly common in cases of sexual assault, where police often force the victim to go through a second round of victimization in reporting their story, and this often results in hesitancy to report those crimes. And many research have focused on what are called suitable targets as main drivers of crime. Suitable targets are people who are routinely exposed to crime or who, for other reasons, have heightened vulnerability to be victims of crime. According to this theory of victimization, there are three characteristics that place people at higher risk of victimization. One, vulnerability, or tangible or perceived physical weakness or psychological distress. Two, gratifiability, or victim qualities or attributes that the offender wants or desires to manipulate. And three, antagonism, when an individual or group identity may spark hostility and resentment. Think of the rise in racist hate crimes against a number of cultural or ethnic groups over the past several years. In the end, these three features make an individual or group more likely to be the victim of a particular crime. Let me be clear, this approach does not blame victims for being victimized, but the idea of suitable targets should actually be used less to talk about victims and more to talk about why perpetrators seek out those types of individuals and groups. For your read, watch, and respond, please answer the following questions. Who are considered suitable targets for crime, and why? What makes people target suitable people and environments? Researchers tend to disagree about the causes of criminal behavior. Some posit that property crimes are the result of rational calculations of risk versus probability, which is called rational choice theory. Others hold that crime occurs when there is an unequal power and influence balance between competing groups. This will likely remind you of conflict theory. Some suggest that crime will increase whenever there is social inequality. Scholars focusing on deterrence tend to argue that strict law enforcement and harsh sentencing will resolve the crime problem, and this approach is called deterrence theory. While critical prison scholars often maintain that prisons harden and teach criminal patterns, causing as many problems as they solve, and this is called prisonization theory. There are a number of structural functionalist perspectives on crime that have been widely influential in informing criminal justice policy over the past several decades. The first of these is called social disorganization theory, where crime results from a breakdown in social norms and social integration following rapid social change. According to this perspective, rapid social change leads to a loss of social cohesion, which in turn increases the likelihood of criminal behaviors such as robbery or assault. The resulting exposure to chronic random violence produces individuals who are more likely to act violently. On the other hand, increased cohesion with little to no crime and strong social control mechanisms is said to reduce crime. A second structural functionalist perspective on crime is Travis Hirschi's social bond theory, often called social control theory. Social bond theory posits that crime results from a breakdown in social bonds of attachment, commitment, belief, and involvement. Bonds with family and community, commitment to personal goals, belief in moral ways of life, and involvement in group activities confirm conforming behaviors and thus decrease the likelihood of crime. Social bond theory has perhaps been the most influential theory in community law enforcement and policing strategies, as community policing was created as a way to enhance social bonds within and amongst the community. A third structural functionalist perspective is strain or anomie theory. Strain is produced when social structure prevents people from achieving culturally defined goals through legitimate means. Agnew's general strain theory, for example, holds that among youth, other factors are likely to incite criminal behavior in response to the strains mentioned by Merton. Strains that are more likely to lead to crime are 1. Seen as unjust, 2. Seen as high in magnitude, 3. Are associated with low social control, and 4. Create some pressure or incentive to engage in criminal coping. In other words, when the system is created with culturally defined goals in place, like buying a home or a fancy new car, but many folks lack the legitimate means to achieve those goals, like if there's rampant unemployment or lack of stable financial income, there is an inherent tension cause that, for many, leads to crime. This tension produces what is called anomie, or a condition characterized by a breakdown of norms and personal disorganization, which may lead to crime. Perhaps the most famous strain theory is Robert Merton's deviance typology. In it, Merton holds that crime is the result of people being socialized into different variations of expecting success but not achieving it. These deviance types are conformity, or when folks accept both the institutional means, such as getting a job and working for money, and the cultural goals, like the house and the car, and thereby conform to rules. Innovation is when folks accept the cultural goals but reject the institutionalized means for getting there. Think of, say, drug traffickers here. Ritualism is when folks reject the cultural goals but accept the institutionalized means. Think here of the never-ending low-paid bureaucrat. Retreatism is when folks reject both the cultural goals and institutionalized means, and thereby retreat from society as a whole. And rebellion when folks try to create new means and new goals. Think of the so-called terrorist in this archetype. A final structural functionalist perspective on crime is ironically conflict theory. While most conflict theories run directly against structural functionalism, in the context of criminology, conflict theory has actually been in simpatico with structural functionalism. Conflict theories of crime and violence point to inequalities in society as the cause of such deviant behavior, that they produce the structural conditions for crime in society. Criminal activity increases as inequality increases as well. Dominant ideology and formal laws protect the privileged status of the ruling class and mask white-collar crimes that benefit the social elite. I want to be clear, conflict theory still holds positions that can never be amenable with structural functionalism, most notably in the fact that they do not simply use sort of status quo as a placeholder for proper functioning of the system. For your read, watch, and respond, please answer the following questions. What are the differences between social disorganization theory and strain theory in terms of the way that each explains crime and its emergence? There are also two important symbolic interactionist perspectives on crime and deviance. The first of these is the social constructivist approach, which focuses on how different behaviors come to be socially understood and defined as quote-unquote deviant. For constructivists, behaviors are not innately right or wrong. They only become wrong, deviant, or criminal when someone in power ascribes a moral value to them. Laws construct that which is criminal from that which is considered unacceptable. Most notably in this respect is Howard Becker's labeling theory, where the self-identity of individuals may be determined or influenced by the terms institutions and people use to describe or classify them. For example, the labels juvenile delinquent, criminal, felon, gang member, etc. For Becker, deviance is not a quality of the act a person commits, rather a consequence of the application by others of rules and sanctions to a quote-unquote offender. Being labeled as a deviant or criminal may promote further deviancy, and the person may be unable to escape the stigmatization and internalizes the deviant identity, or the gang member identity, or the juvenile delinquent identity. Finally, one of the most influential symbolic interactionist perspectives on crime is differential association theory, often called social learning theory. It holds that crime is learned through interaction with others. Individuals learn the values, attitudes, and techniques of criminal behavior. Edwin Sutherland's differential association theory argues that people are social beings who tend to imitate each other to gain acceptance and approval. This is accomplished through frequent and close association. Individuals eventually adopt the reasoning and rationale of their peers. Seeing criminals act illegally without consequence can teach others the motives, rationales, and attitudes of such a lifestyle. In this way, you can empirically assess what is called differential socialization, or the process whereby people learn to behave in accordance with prevailing standards of culture. To deal with crime in Canada and elsewhere, we have erected an entire justice system based on deterrence. This assumes that crimes are rational acts in which the offender weighs the imagined benefits of committing the crime against the probability of being caught and the severity of the punishment. It assumes that crime is less likely if the chance of being punished is high, and law enforcers are efficient in apprehending offenders. There are two forms of deterrence in this model: general and specific. General deterrence is when you deter the entire society from engaging in a crime through things like arrest, detention, and prison. The messages sent out on media through covering criminal trials is that anyone could go to prison for committing a crime, and this is a form of general deterrence. Specific deterrence, on the other hand, is the idea that you specifically could get a certain prison sentence that is tailored to you. If you get charged, for example, you will ultimately get a specific prison sentence that is said to be in line with the crime committed. This is intended to stop you from engaging in crime. But this model fails to address the societal, economic, and political factors that encourage crime, like unemployment, racial inequality, poverty, etc. Critical criminologists have thus argued that the criminal justice system must be radically reformed to address the actual drivers of crime, rather than simply punish them to send deterrence messages that have been empirically invalidated. In Canada and elsewhere, we have devised a massive criminal justice system that is always expanding to deal with crime after the fact, rather than paying serious attention to the social conditions which make crime more or less likely. Indeed, there are a number of social consequences of crime and violence in society. For instance, media almost exclusively talk about violent street crimes. Most people arrested are undereducated, poor, unemployed, or working in low-wage, low-status jobs. Police, courts, and politicians target lower-income criminals and often overlook upper-income criminals. There are equally high rates of crime amongst the wealthy, yet far lower rates of conviction. We know these things through crime victimization surveying and self-reported data. Another example is the emergence of so-called hotspot policing, based off routine activities theory, which posits crime happens when there is a suitable target, a lack of capable guardian, and a motivated offender. This policing approach has led to more police in low socioeconomic status areas, and there is a causal relationship between police presence and crime rates. The more police, the more crime. This has caused a number of criminologists to empirically demonstrate that it isn't the fact that there is more crime happening in those locations, but that hotspot policing means that police are there to see it, report it, and make corresponding arrests. In a law enforcement context, racial profiling could refer to specific actions of the police, such as traffic stops, search, cite, arrest, or search practices that target particular racialized groups, as well as mainstream law practitioners' justifications of such actions. There is a well-documented history of the use of what's called carding amongst Canadian law enforcement agencies. Carding is an inherently problematic, intelligence-gathering social policy involving the stopping, questioning, and documenting of individuals when no offense is suspected or even being investigated. Research has shown that it is heavily racialized. And further muddying the waters here, most police forces in Canada don't collect race-based data on such things as traffic stops. So it is almost impossible to get conclusive information about the extent of racial profiling in Canada. This has led to a wide movement amongst scholars to not only collect and release such data, but also understand how law enforcement themselves contribute to systemic racism, discrimination, and prejudice against already vulnerable and marginalized groups. So that's it for today. I hope you learned something about crime, deviance, and the criminal justice system. This has been Professor Silva, and I'll catch you on the next episode of Social Problems.